made 1,000 people feel like idiots at once, and you didn't even raise your voice. You didn't throw a tantrum, you didn't launch a campaign, you just moved, like you'd been carrying a secret they couldn't steal. And suddenly their confidence cracked. They laughed once, remember? Not because you were funny, but because they were certain you wouldn't rise. Because your stillness confused them, because your ambition didn't match their expectations, because they mistook your quiet as cluelessness. And then when you emerged, not just ahead, but untouchable, they all felt the sting of misunderstanding someone who no longer needed to explain, the sting of dismissing what they didn't understand. And now they sit with that burn, some in denial, some in silence, but all of them looking over their shoulders at the person they thought was a joke, becoming the punchline they never saw coming. They underestimated you in unison. There's something almost poetic about that kind of collective blindness. One by one, they nodded along with each other's ignorance. They weaponized their groupthink and called it truth. They created memes out of your name, whispered doubts behind your back, celebrated your smallest failures as if they were victories. You were their distraction, their scapegoat, their punchline. But in the shadows, you were building something, not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. That's the difference. You didn't rise out of spite. You rose out of design. And now the people who once smirked in rooms you weren't invited to have gone quiet, because what you've become can't be debated anymore. It can only be watched. What they never understood is that depth doesn't scream. Vision doesn't ask for permission. You never tried to compete with their noise. You simply chose a frequency they weren't tuned into. While they performed, you prepared. While they bragged, you built. And while they thought they were ahead, you were becoming the curve they couldn't calculate. The moment you arrived, fully, fearlessly, without apology. It wasn't just shocking, it was humiliating. Not because you rubbed it in their faces, but because your existence now invalidates everything they said. They weren't just wrong, they were loudly wrong, publicly wrong, spectacularly wrong. And your presence is now the mirror they can't shatter. You didn't need an audience. That's what makes your rise unbearable to them, because they needed attention like oxygen. They moved in packs. You moved in purpose. They were addicted to applause. You were addicted to the vision. And when the curtain dropped and the noise faded and results began to speak louder than gossip ever could, they realized they had nothing left. Nothing to say, nothing to offer, no power to reclaim. Because the joke was never you, it was their certainty. Their certainty that someone so calm, so patient, so apparently behind, couldn't be the storm approaching in silence. You've exposed the weakness of their arrogance, because anyone can mock what they don't understand. It's the cheapest kind of dominance. Bullying disguised as critique, exclusion disguised as taste. But now that you're undeniable, they're scrambling to rewrite their memory of you. I always knew there was something about them. I supported them from the beginning, lies dressed as redemption. But the truth doesn't forget. You do. You forget the names, you forget the mockery, but the truth, it remembers. And the truth is this: they weren't laughing because they knew who you were. They were laughing because they feared who you might become. And now they're watching that fear come true. Frame by frame, moment by moment, silently, there's a psychological satisfaction in restraint. You didn't call them out. You didn't tag them in your success. You didn't turn your evolution into a grudge match. You simply became. And that becoming, elegant, focused, silent, is their punishment. Because when 1,000 people share a delusion, and that delusion is shattered by reality, it doesn't just bruise ego, it rewires it. They walk differently now, more cautious, less cocky, because they've learned the hard way, underestimating the quiet one, the outsider, the late bloomer, is a gamble that rarely pays off. They don't just feel foolish because you proved them wrong. They feel foolish because they followed each other. They didn't form opinions, they followed trends. They didn't think critically, they joined the chorus. And when the song changed, when the harmony broke, they found themselves humming a melody that no longer exists. You were never the one out of tune. You were simply playing an instrument they didn't recognize. Now they all want to learn your rhythm, but it's too late. You're too far ahead. You're no longer a participant in their performance. You're the composer of your own score. Let them sit in the awkward silence of their own misjudgment. Let them taste the irony of being so loudly wrong. You don't owe them clarity. You don't owe them inclusion. Because this was never about revenge. This was about return. Returning to the version of you that didn't require permission, that didn't need defending, that didn't shrink just to fit inside their approval. You didn't rise because they doubted you. You rose because your vision refused to die in their mediocrity. And now that vision is real, tactile, unstoppable, and they are the footnotes in a story they never saw being written. The air has changed. You can feel it when you walk into the room. They pause now. They study. They wonder what else they missed. They wonder who else they've underestimated. But mostly, they wonder how someone they mocked in unison now commands their silence without saying a single word. You didn't just win. You rewrote the terms of winning. You didn't just arrive. You erased the need to be welcomed. You didn't make noise. You made history. And that's something no crowd, no matter how loud, can ever undo. You sat with the discomfort of being misunderstood. That's what they'll never comprehend. How you stayed silent when lies spread like fire. How you didn't flinch when your name was dragged through conversations laced with distortion. They expected you to defend, to beg, to clarify every rumor with trembling hands. But you didn't. You watched the performance unfold from the shadows, and in the stillness, you learned. You saw who clapped, who whispered, who stayed silent, not out of neutrality, but out of cowardice. You let them misunderstand you, not because you lacked truth, but because you understood a deeper truth. Real power doesn't perform for the ignorant. It waits. It rebuilds. It returns without permission. They had no idea what it costs to be quiet when being loud could prove your innocence. They underestimated the weight you carried, holding in every response you could have fired, every truth you could have unsheathed. You let their noise echo while you learned to breathe through the ache of being framed as something you're not. You weren't passive. You were precise. You saw that correction in the hands of fools as a waste of breath, so you conserved it. You trained your lungs to expand in silence. You sat in your solitude like a throne, not because you felt royal, but because you were reclaiming your crown. Piece by broken piece. Alone. Misread. Misnamed. But not misaligned. You became fluent in loneliness without victimhood. That's a rare language. You didn't seek pity. You sought perspective. You stared into the eyes of betrayal and refused to blink. And while they distorted you in public, you reconstructed yourself in private, not for vengeance, for clarity, for sovereignty, for the unshakable knowledge that you are no longer someone who bends for false validation. You stopped needing to be liked when you saw how cheap approval becomes in the hands of the small-minded. And that shift, that internal shift, it made you dangerous. Because no one can control someone who no longer fears misunderstand. They fed off the version of you they invented. And when you didn't protest, when you let them build their fictional shrine to your supposed failure, they mistook your silence as admission. But you knew the truth. Some fires are better watched than extinguished. You let it burn. You let their delusions rise like smoke, knowing that ashes speak louder than words. And now, they stand in the wreckage of their certainty, holding a portrait of you that no longer matches reality. You changed. Not suddenly, but steadily. Not for them, but because of them. Your evolution wasn't loud, but it was relentless. Psychologically, being misunderstood triggers the ego. It screams to be seen correctly, to correct the record, to reclaim the narrative. But you didn't answer that scream. You silenced it. You learned to breathe without external affirmation. You became your own witness, your own audience. You gave yourself the compassion they withheld, and in doing so, you developed a resilience they'll never fathom, the kind of strength that doesn't come from proving your point, but from knowing your point doesn't require an audience to exist. They still don't get it. They still think your silence was weakness, that your refusal to retaliate meant you had no defense. But what they don't see is that your silence was a strategy. You let them speak. You let them reveal themselves. You let the truth gather like a storm in the distance, and when it came, it needed no introduction. You walked into the light with nothing but your presence, and it was enough to collapse the entire theater they built around you. They were acting. You were becoming. And when the curtain dropped, their applause turned to confusion. There's a cruelty to being mischaracterized by people you once trusted, and yet, you didn't let it turn you bitter. You transmuted it. You used every false story as a stepping stone, every rumor as a reminder, every insult as a mirror to their own insecurities. You became the architect of your own understanding, the keeper of your own truth. And now, you walk with an energy that cannot be explained to those who only knew you by the version of you they invented to feel superior. You don't owe them an update. You don't owe them a reintroduction. They chose their chapter. You finished the book. You wear peace now not as a trend, but as armor. A peace born from standing in the fire of misunderstanding and refusing to scream. A peace forged in knowing that silence can be both shield and sword. They still expect the old you to show up, to crack, to plead, to offer clarity, but that person no longer exists. You buried them in the graveyard of your past, and at the headstone, you left no name, just a lesson. Those who require misunderstanding to stay comfortable are not worthy of your voice. They moved in packs, you moved in purpose. That's the first distinction that shattered their illusion of superiority. They always needed backup to feel brave, validation to feel smart, and a crowd to feel strong. Each one of them alone was a whisper. Together they were noise, loud enough to distract, never deep enough to wound you. They hunted in circles, cloaking their fear as unity. They surrounded you with scrutiny, hoping your isolation would mean surrender. But what they didn't see, what they were too shallow to recognize, was that you were never alone. You were focused. You didn't need a pack. You were building direction in silence, while they danced in a carousel of cowardice. You were walking towards something, while they were circling nothing. Their bond was forged in fear. Fear of being the next target, fear of being the outcast. They nodded along with cruelty, not out of conviction, but out of desperation. Desperation to belong. Desperation to avoid the gaze they turned on you. They didn't think as individuals, they echoed each other's bitterness, recycled each other's pettiness. You were a project to them, a figure to dissect, to mock, to misunderstand on purpose, because seeing you clearly would require them to confront what they lacked. And that was a mirror they weren't ready to face. So instead they clung to one another, repeating the same tired lines, hoping that volume would make them right. But all they built was a chorus. You weren't loud. You didn't campaign for attention. You didn't compete in the arena they constructed to break you. You moved with intention, step by step, choice by choice. You weren't reactionary, you were architectural. You didn't waste energy swatting at flies when you were too busy planting seeds. While they grouped up like scavengers looking for weakness, you refined your instincts in solitude. You learned how to stand alone, not out of pride, but out of necessity. And in that isolation, you found something they never would. Self-respect that did not require applause. They called you arrogant for walking your own path. They called you cold for no longer offering explanations. But what they couldn't say, what their egos couldn't stomach, was that you scared them. Because you were sovereign, not perfect, but whole. You had no allegiance to their games. You didn't fold for their acceptance. You didn't adapt to their mood swings. You weren't one of them. And in a world that survives on conformity, that made you dangerous. You were the one who could walk through fire without asking who lit the match. They moved in packs to feel invincible. But you, with nothing but your truth, moved in a straight line toward freedom. Psychologically, groupthink is an anesthetic. It dulls guilt. It justifies cowardice. In packs, they could validate each other's cruelty. They could look at your strength and call it ego, look at your boundaries and call them bitterness. But all they were doing was projecting their own fragility, because deep down they knew they didn't have the spine to stand where you stood. They needed each other to co-sign their weakness. You didn't need anyone. And that solitude, that terrifying independence, made every step you took feel like a warning. You were a walking contradiction to their survival strategy. And they hated you for it. When they saw you alone, they assumed you were losing. When you didn't beg for inclusion, they assumed you had nothing. But now that you've risen, unbought, unbroken, unafraid, they don't know what to make of you, because your success doesn't resemble theirs. It doesn't require a cheering section. It doesn't come with cheap alliances or whispered betrayals. It comes from intention, from resilience, from long nights spent confronting your demons without a single witness. Your glow doesn't blind, it exposes, and now they have to squint to look at you, because you remind them of everything they pretended not to envy. They move differently now, less bold, more careful. You've altered the atmosphere, not with revenge, but with elevation. You are the evidence that the solitary path, the one paved in discipline, clarity, and rejection, is the one that lasts. Their pack offered safety. Yours offered transformation. They played the game of image. You played the game of truth. And the game of truth always wins, slowly, then all at once. Now, they are just spectators, watching what happens when someone refuses to be another echo in the room and instead becomes the voice that lingers long after the noise dies. They whisper about you now. They try to retell the story, soften the past, insert themselves into your journey retroactively. They want proximity to your purpose now, but it's too late. You've already moved past the version of you that needed to be understood. You no longer hand out explanations like apologies. You no longer bend to make others comfortable. You are walking with your eyes forward and your soul intact. And those who once laughed at your solitude now mimic your moves in shadows. But they'll never replicate the essence, because the essence wasn't taught. It was earned. Alone, that internal shift, it made you dangerous, not to the world, but to the people who once controlled you through confusion. You didn't grow louder, you grew clearer. You didn't lash out, you unplugged. And nothing terrifies a manipulative mind more than someone who no longer needs chaos to feel alive. You used to give them everything, your time, your explanations, your vulnerabilities served on a silver tray. You thought being understood would earn you safety, but all it did was give them maps to your weaknesses. Now you speak with fewer words and heavier silence. You move with restraint, and it's that restraint that rattles them. Because before, your heart was a hallway open to everyone. Now it's a fortress with no drawbridge. They can't enter. They can't predict. And what can't be predicted can't be played. You didn't raise your standards. You remembered them. You didn't stop caring. You stopped caretaking. There's a difference. You peeled back the layers of your identity that were shaped by survival. The performer, the people pleaser, the fixer, all of them buried. Not because you hated those versions of yourself, but because you finally saw who created them. Every mask was a reaction to someone else's comfort. Every trait that made you palatable was a negotiation with your own pain. When that realization hit, something in you broke, quietly but beautifully. You didn't just grow, you mutated into someone who no longer makes space for distortion. And that mutation, it didn't give you claws, it gave you clarity. And clarity, in the eyes of those who survive on confusion, is lethal. They call it a phase. They call you cold now, distant. They speak of your change like it was an affliction. What they really mean is you're no longer easy to control. Before, they knew your scripts. They had seen you bend under pressure, smile through disrespect, explain what didn't deserve explanation. Now, when they attempt the same tactics, they hit a wall. You no longer bleed on cue. You don't offer context to the wrong people. You don't defend your growth. That emotional stillness, it's terrifying, because when someone who once broke easily becomes unshakable, it forces everyone who knew the old version to confront their role in your past destruction, and most aren't ready to see it. Psychologically, power dynamics require imbalance. Someone has to be the mirror while the other plays the actor. You were the mirror, you were the stage, you were the applause, and they were just the show. But the moment you stepped out of that cycle, when you stopped reflecting back what they wanted to see, everything collapsed. The power they thought they had over you was revealed to be borrowed. They weren't in control, you were simply unaware, you were unconscious. But now, you've woken up, and waking up is dangerous because it's permanent. Once you see who someone is without the mask, you can't unsee it. And now, you carry that vision with you. Not bitter, just immune. You used to overcorrect. Every time someone painted you wrong, you'd rush to prove them otherwise. You'd exhaust yourself trying to be good in the eyes of people who only saw you as a reflection of their own projections. But you've stopped correcting. You've stopped offering the performance, because you realized that being good in their narrative required being absent in your own. And that price? Too high. So now you walk through rooms without adjusting your volume. You no longer shrink to avoid triggering fragile egos. That unapologetic presence, that unshakable pace, that's what they fear. You don't explain who you are anymore. You embody it. And embodiment has no room for permission. They want you to feel guilt for who you've become. But you don't. Because guilt was a leash they pulled whenever you grew beyond their control. They dressed it up as morality, as humility. But it was always about control. And now, guilt doesn't land where it used to. You've rerouted your empathy. It no longer bleeds toward those who drain you. It flows inward, toward healing, toward remembering, toward restoring the parts of you that were buried under years of self-erasure. That restoration, it made you calm. And calm people who used to be chaotic, they don't just change the room, they own it. You've become selective in ways that scream without a word. You don't return every call. You don't answer every question. You don't explain your silence. Your absence is now an answer. Your delay is a decision. Your boundaries are not soft anymore. They're steel wrapped in velvet. And those who were once used to walking through your soul without shoes now find the door locked. And when they knock, they hear nothing. That nothing echoes. That echo terrifies them. Because they know you used to care. And now, your indifference is no longer passive. It's earned.